microphone. First, thank you for coming. I always have to thank people for coming because sometimes I get a surprise. Sometimes 2 people show up. And other times you get the other surprise. They tell you, oh, just 20, 25 people. And then they bring you into a big room where there are 500 people, you know. And if you prepare for one or you prepare for the other, you have to make a quick adjustment. With the 2 people, I say, here are 2 chairs, let's just sit and talk. The other thing is, I always worry about an introduction. You know, Jose Cordero is a very, very good friend, but I have been introduced in some peculiar ways. And the one that I remember most was when I first went to Latin America many, many years ago. And they had not worked with economists in the Ministry of Education in this country. Well, I'll tell you the name of the country, even though it's a difficult country right now. This is Venezuela. And Caracas, Venezuela was different in those days. It was only a few years after the so-called democracy, after the dictator had to be run out of town, as they say. And people were in a state of joy, of happiness, because they felt open, freedom. And so they had a very large gathering, and the chair of the gathering said, today I bring you Cristobal Colon. And I had to think quickly, and I thought, you know, in the US they say Columbus discovered America, and people think that's New York, you know, or Chicago, or San Francisco. But I thought very quickly, and I said, of course America is like this, so he discovered Venezuela too. Maybe not Caracas because it was too high in the mountains, but at least Maiquetía, you know, the airport right on the litoral. And so I thought, this is very nice. What a nice, warm introduction to be called Cristobal Colon, someone who was great at adventures, someone who had imagination, and so on. You know, because we all have stories about, they're probably not true, but about Cristobal Colon, all right? So he kept going, and he said, like Cristobal Colon, this man didn't know where he was going. And he said, and also, like Colon, when he got there, he didn't know where he was. And most of all, he is like Cristobal Colon because he traveled at the government's expense. So my understanding today is I did not travel at the government expense, all right? So no one called me Cristobal Colon, okay? What I wanted to talk to you about was the cost of early childhood education. And around the world, we see a great deal of attention to this particular subject. Now, let me be very specific. We're referring to the period from birth. Some people say prenatal, but let's start off with birth to 5 years old, to the period before young children enter the primary school. And in some countries here, we talk about age 3, but what is happening around the world is that the age is getting younger and younger for this pre-primary education. And the reason is that discoveries in the last decade and a half show profound development in the early years, profound development in the brain, ways that cannot easily be altered later. That is ways that get into what we call the soft wiring, but without abilities to change the way that young people function from the kind of development that takes place in these very early years. And so what we're seeing is an expansion of early childhood education around the world. And the origin of this project was that UNESCO, seeing that I had done a lot of work on costs of education, said, well, what we want to know is, what is the cost of early childhood education? Now, that may sound like a subject that is very specific, compacto, and it turns out it is not. Let me just give you some numbers at the beginning. We looked at as much of the literature as we could find, the yearbooks of the international organizations on this topic. We could find data on costs for only 17 countries. I don't think that the data on the costs was comparable, but for the moment, let's assume that it was. And the numbers ran from $64 a year, which is a very tiny amount, $64 por año, to $12,000 a year. These were in the Scandinavian countries, where they spent a great deal on it. $64 was in Indonesia. A miracle, right? So the question was, what can account for such large differences in expenditures on this topic? What are the numbers that I should use in talking to UNESCO about what the cost is? Because they wanted to see, with all of the year of this and the year of that and the year of the little child and the year of the big child and the year of the travieso, you know, what does it cost? And so that was the purpose of this study. And what we did is we revised it. We brought it kind of up to date for this recent publication in the Hacienda Pública. Yeah. So that has more recent information than for our UNESCO report, which was delivered, I think, in 2005. So what I will do is I will go ahead and just give you some of these details. Now, I am not an expert in the early childhood education part, although it turns out that in the last years I am on the board of a foundation which funded a very famous study. And that study is called the Preschool Study. And I'll say more about preschool, why it's famous in just a few minutes. So my themes are, what is early childhood education? Why is it important? Why do the costs differ? What kinds of quality and services are included in this area of education? And how do we establish cost comparability? As I mentioned, early childhood education is a topic that varies immensely in terms of how it's defined by a particular society, even how it's defined by a psychologist, how it's defined by educators. But broadly speaking, it begins at birth and extends to 5 years of age. And we can think of it broadly as pre-primary, but normally when we think of pre-primary, we think of just the 1 or 2 years before primary school. And here we are talking about a larger range of years because we are going back to birth. Second aspect is that there's a focus on both the cognitive and the socio-emotional learning. Traditionally, we've seen a focus more on the cognitive, at least in terms of measurement, in terms of assessment, you know, the focus of Ismael's center here, the focus traditionally has been, what have they learned? Can we measure at the age of 5 what effect this has, you know, an evaluation on their learning and their preparation for primary school? But that has shifted considerably for several reasons. One reason is that it's recognized that learning is based as much on socio-emotional growth and development as it is on cognitive stimulation. And so we're seeing much more attention to that in both the developmental studies, but also in terms of evaluations today. And as you know, the cognitive usually includes pre-school preparation for literacy and numeracy, an emphasis on pretty basic skills, pretty basic cognitive skills, and we'll get back to that in a few minutes. The socio-emotional learning includes both what we call intrapersonal development, developing relations with others, productive relations with others, and interpersonal development, the development internally of kinds of characteristics that one needs to be able to address both one's own needs as well as one's relationship to the larger world. The interpersonal examples I can give are patience, developing patience, thoughtfulness, planning, impulse control, the appropriate display of emotions, and so on. And the interpersonal examples: collaboration, cooperation, listening skills, discourse, conflict resolution. These are all examples. I mean, we could make very long lists in both areas, but these are examples of what we are referring to, okay? And what we've learned, and this is by scientists who work on the nervous system, on the brain, on psychological development, in all of these areas, is that much more of this development in both cognitive and non-cognitive areas takes place early in life. By early in life, I don't mean at age 3. I'm talking about in the first months of life. And it requires early stimulation. It requires stimulation to obtain this kind of healthy development. Language, thinking, social development, all of these begin very early, and we know also that they're the basis for success in school, in childhood, and in adult life. So in a sense, they are the early stages of development on which we can measure specific developments in later childhood and in adulthood. There's a particular concern for children from lower socioeconomic families, from poor families. And that is that they often lack the resources, the kind of knowledge, education, material resources to provide that stimulation. And so we see differences when children arrive at school if they do not have these kinds of interventions, particularly on the basis of social class. Large differences in social class. So this is also considered an important approach, not only for developing, you could say, the potential of a society, but also for providing greater equity in terms of access, ultimately, to development and to the accomplishments that come out of development. And it has other benefits that we can talk about, but we're not going to emphasize these. And one of them is it provides childcare for working families. Even if it does not provide stimulation and services, it makes it possible for people to work. Now, the problem here is that often childcare and early education is thought of in some societies, particularly the poorer societies, as simply taking the children and putting them in a place, what we call the teoría de almacén, almacén de los niños. And that is not very effective in terms of development. What we know is scientifically it's not a very healthy way of trying to provide development, okay? But it's very good for the industrias de almacenes, okay? So let's go to what we know about this kind of development. And I mentioned the peri-preschool. Now, the peri-preschool, especially by the standards of people in this room, took place in the time of your abuelos, okay? But I was an active professional at this time, so I was very aware of it. But 1963 to 1965, those were the dates. And why is this important? Because for the first time, what happened is we did, and I was not part of the experiment. I'm not part of the Fundación, but I was not part of the experiment at all. They did a randomized control trial. That is a true experiment in which a number of children were chosen randomly from a large pool to be in the experiment, in the so-called treatment, the tratamiento of early childhood education. And then there was a matching group also randomly chosen from this larger pool to be in the control group. So they were equivalent groups. And this is almost the definition of an experiment, to have equivalent groups that you can compare. And this really had not been done before. Of course, this was, 50 years ago. And so you have to take account of 50 years ago we hadn't developed evaluation techniques as we have today. These were all poor black children in a small city in Michigan, right next to Detroit, a city called Ypsilanti. And what's interesting is that the researchers followed these children to the age of 40. So we know what happened to these children from the age of 3 to 5, not 0 to 5 in this case, but 3 to 5, all the way up to their lives at age 40. In fact, there were studies in between at age 19, at age 27, at age 40, and right now there's a data collection, an encuesta, at age 50 to find out what happened at age 50. Now, there's a problem with the age 50, so I don't know whether to be hopeful, but this is a population that was particularly deprived, deficient in terms of resources, and they're dying young. So at the age of 50, we're already seeing enough deaths that we're losing statistical power in the estimates, and we'll see what happens. But you will hear about the age 50 results in perhaps 2 or 3 years when the study is finished. What did we find through age 40? And when I say we, Clive Belfield was one of the researchers on this, so he's part of my group. We have a center for the study of benefit, cost, and cost effectiveness in education. And so we were asked to do some of the work at age 40, so we actually did participate in this part. And what you find is better educational results. It was more likely, for example, that the experimental students who had had this treatment at ages 3 to 5 had graduated from secondary school, had completed secondary school. They also were more likely to participate in at least some form of post-secondary education. That doesn't mean they were university graduates, very few, but they had at least some post-secondary educational experience. There was considerably less crime from the group that had been in the preschool. They received much less public assistance. They had higher incomes, and if you think about that, they're paying back the taxpayer, because out of the higher income, there's higher tax revenues. And so that's ultimately paying for the program, but all of this is paying for the program. That is, these are benefits to the taxpayer and to society, because less crime means less investment in the criminal justice system. Better educational results, as we've mentioned, provides all kinds of better participation in society, civic behavior, higher income, higher tax revenues, less public assistance, reduces the cost to the taxpayer in that particular area. And so we did a benefit cost study. Others did benefit cost studies at age 19, at age 27, and a conservative figure of the benefit to cost is that there are $7 in benefits to the taxpayer per each dollar of investment, and that's in present value, by the way. So those of you who worry about the fact that the benefits are in the future and the costs are today, pay them right now, don't worry about it, because all of these numbers are in present values, okay? So there have been at least 4 or 5 other studies that have also followed up, not for as many years, but they find a similar pattern, that investments early in this period, before a child reaches primary school, have very substantial effects in terms of improving education. I should also add that these children were less likely to have been found with disabilities and placed in special education. They were less likely to be retained in the same grade. That's very expensive. If you keep a child in the 4th grade for 2 years, you pay twice for basically what is the same thing. And this kind of early preparation reduced both of those, reduced special education and reduced the grade repetition. So we have a lot of evidence that not only are there important effects, you could say developmentally, with these kind of investments in the early years, but that economically they're very good investments. You know, if we just take like banqueros, think about the returns and what it's going to cost us. It's a good investment. Okay, so now the question is, how do we explain these cost differences? Now, one of the things is that if you want to find out what the costs are in different countries, you will be very frustrated, because we found 17 countries that we were able to get costs from, but 17 out of, even if you take the OECD countries, there are, I think, 32 OECD countries right now. You cannot get costs for 32 countries. If you start to talk about developing countries outside of the OECD, very few have any numbers, but most of the numbers are not very helpful anyway. And this is because they use different systems of accounting. In some countries, they have very careful systems of accounting, but based on their own principles of accounting. In others, the number comes from Fulano, who was told by his jefe that we need to know what the cost is for each child in early childhood education. And what he does is he gets cerveza, una caña, and says, and writes down a number, and that becomes the official number, okay, for the jefe. It's nothing more than that. And I can give you stories where I have worked with such people in countries and asked about the numbers, and they say, the number is the number we agree upon. Si hay acuerdo, es correcto, okay? So you have to give a little charity as you start to read even the numbers that are given, but we could only, at that time, in probably 2011, which is when we made our revisions, find 17 countries that will even make an effort to provide the number. So why do you get such large cost differences? $64 to $12,000, that's quite a ratio. Well, the first thing is enrollments, so we'll talk about that. The second is the kinds of services provided. Remember I said almacén, but at the other end, there are very luxurious services, okay? Muy lujo, okay, that all of us would want for our own children, you know. And then the quality of the services. Quality is very important. If we look at the research on the effects of early childhood development, we see that simply saying that we have a national program of early childhood development is not adequate, because the question is at what level of quality? And there are very big differences in terms of levels of quality. We see this in the US. I mean, since 1965, we have had our Head Start program for children from low-income families. On average, the results, at least in terms of student achievement as students begin schools, on average, there are good results in favor of the Head Start children, but not spectacular, relatively small differences. But when one disaggregates the data, one finds very large differences in some centers, no difference, some would even say negative differences in others. So that we have a lot of mediocre centers, we have a few really outstanding centers in this very large national program, and then a few terrible centers that are run really for the employment, empleo de la comunidad, no los niños. That happens in many places, so I don't think that this is a totally strange concept for us, but it's something that we have to be concerned about. Okay, so let's talk about enrollments. Well, obviously, the first thing that determines enrollments is the child demography. Some societies, like this one, you're not producing a lot of children in this society. Even when the government gave bonuses for children. Very often the immigrants took advantage, but the natives did not. And so in a way that helps keep down costs. That's good from a cost point of view. But the important point is that when you get large differences in demography and the numbers of children who are in the appropriate age groups, you get big differences in total costs. We're not dealing for the moment with the cost per student, but in total costs. So it affects your total enrollment. Who is eligible to be enrolled? Well, it's in a particular age category. In some countries, it's also limited by the economic situation of the family. So the child demography in those categories is very important. I mentioned the eligibility requirements, income limits in some countries, and if you bring these programs down from age 3 to 5, down to age 2, age 1, infancy, costs go up considerably, because the costs at the lowest levels are very resource intensive. Very resource intensive. And one of the issues is, given that they're resource intensive, what are the benefits? Now, in economics, as you know, the earlier you make the investment and the later you get the rendimiento, the more difficult it is to find that there are high benefits to costs. Well, if you start these programs in infancy, you start the cost very early, but the benefits come much, much later. So there are real issues here. And again, as I've mentioned, that the costs for infant programs are very intensive. Basically, you don't bring infants to a center. You bring the personnel to the home to work with the parents. So this is a much more costly way of doing things. And it's only later, at about 6 months, you can start a program where, at least on a part-time basis, you can bring the child to a center. But even then, it's maybe 2 times a week for a couple of hours. So there are reasons to look very carefully at when the program begins, what ages, and of course that will affect things, as well as the question of who is eligible for the program. Participation rates. You would think that with this kind of service, everyone would want to participate. But in different societies, there are religious reasons that people will not participate, or will not participate in public centers. There are family reasons. Families with economic resources typically do not participate very much in the public institutions, except in the societies where most of the people are middle class, that it's accepted as part of the convention. In France and Sweden and in countries, you see very wide participation, of course. And then there are the issues of private participation. In most societies, there is a private industry that provides these services, and often, again, there's a separation by income in terms of who uses the public sector and who uses the private sector. And then there are issues of the distribution of the population. The rural-urban differences are important. Even if you establish these kinds of services in rural areas, they're often not accessible for very substantial numbers in the population. And also, they are less accustomed to using these kinds of services in rural areas. So these account for some of the differences in enrollments. And when you look at the enrollments at different ages in different societies, not only the pure numbers of enrollments, but also the participation rates, they differ very, very substantially. Okay, services. This is really important, because what people call early childhood education differs immensely from site to site, from country to country. So what are the elements of the services that make for a difference? Well, the first is the length of the service year. We say, well, we provide early childhood education or early childhood services, but in some countries it will be 4 days a week. It will, when holidays come, for 3 weeks there will be no services available at all. During the summer there will be no services. So when one starts to count the days, there are 90 days of services a year. In other societies, it's 300 days. There are countries that even have some services on the weekends, because some people have to work on weekends or there may be other reasons. Well, it obviously makes a difference if you're providing 90 days of services versus 300 days of services. And again, some of this is reflected in the days per week, hours per day. In some of centers, they're 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day. That's all. In others, you have very long days, 16 hours, because some people come early in the morning at 6 o'clock, 6 a.m., and leave their children there till 2. Others come at noon and leave their children there until 8 o'clock in the evening. And so they then make this kind of very, very wide provision. A second area is facilities and transportation. In some cases, the facilities are very, very minimal. In others, they are very substantial, with all kinds of even health facilities available, a music room, various kind of activity rooms, and this makes for some difference, of course, in costs. In some countries, you have transportation to help the parents accompany the children to the centers. Health. In some countries, you have health services provided at this early age, and this is generally considered to be a good idea, because when you get the children, you can observe them, you can screen them for the eyesight, you can screen them for hearing issues, and they can be treated. Obviously, children don't learn a lot, at least visually, if they can't see. And they also don't learn a lot if they have serious hearing deficiencies. But you can also observe various kinds of other developmental challenges in terms of orthopedic challenges, nervous system issues, and if you can then not only diagnose these but also refer them to treatment, this is a way of addressing other kinds of developmental needs. But I want to mention, it's very costly to do this, to actually have nurses on site, to actually be able to get sometimes the National Health Service or some kind of health service, Doctors Without Borders or something like that. There are costs to all of this. Now, I know Doctors with Borders, we pay the costs through charity, but there are still costs. This is one of the concerns that we have, that in many of these countries, if someone else is paying the cost, another bureaucratic agency or a private agency, they don't include it in the cost per child. And in the work that we do, we distinguish between who finances and whether there's a cost. If there are services provided, there's a cost, even if I don't pay for the services. And so we separate out in our analysis the question of what the cost is from the question of who finances it, whereas most of these countries do not do this unless they pay all the costs. Nutrition. Nutrition is very common in some countries, and it almost does not exist in others. In some countries, the parent has to send food, and when we've checked, we find that one of the sad things is that some of the parents just don't have the resources for the food, and so the staff, out of their own pockets, provide some nutrition for the child. But in other countries, it's very common to provide meals, and generally good meals, for the children, to encourage good nutrition and growth through good nutrition. Then there's the question of educational initiatives. In some countries, there's very little that's done educationally to stimulate the children. At the most, well, often I can tell you, they turn on the televisor, and that's the educational influence. Some of them provide enrichment, what is it, enriquecimiento? Enriquecimiento. How do they do that? Someone comes in with a little drum and little cymbal, and they sing songs, and usually patriotic songs, you know, so we start that very early, you know, patria, you know. And anyway, that's the education that's provided. And quite frankly, in others, they are using approaches that Montessori would use, and all kinds of devices, and people are well trained in terms of what children need at different ages and things of this sort. They give you all kinds of lectures. You're doing that wrong. These children are not developmentally ready for that. We did everything wrong with our children too, and it turns out that they were fine, so don't worry about it. But anyway, in these centers, they're so professional, and they have such rich and educated resources that they scare the parents, you know. And then there's the issue of parental education and assistance. In some cases, they bring the parents in, they provide assistance to the parents in terms of how they can stimulate their children, how to use language, and so on. In others, they completely ignore the parents. The parents just drop the children off. The parents are thought of as not having the skills or the competence or the formación to be able to help the children, and just they deliver the child, they pick up the child. In other cases, yet they go to the homes in the early infant period. They go to the homes to help the parents in areas like, in some countries, for example, it's very difficult to pay for the what do you call this? The artificial diet. Why these countries don't encourage their women to use natural milk, I don't know, but it has a lot more to do with the fashion or the image of middle-class women who are immediately, they deliver the baby and then they get out and put on a Chanel dress and walk in. The baby is fed like this, usually by someone else. And unfortunately, this influences a lot of very poor parents who believe that's the way of doing things. That good families, if you want your child to grow up good, you look at what good families do in terms of the way they bring up their children, and they forget that you have a fuente de comida natural right here waiting for the child, and that's the best food that the child can have. But what do? You know what they do. They take the formula and they add water to it. So the child gets a very weak formula, and also the water's not so good. Has amoeba and other things in other kind of nutrients, which are not good nutrients. Let's put it that way. And it's very sad. That's a very sad story. But so you try to educate the parents on good practices for their children, even before the children ever are old enough to get to these centers. That's very expensive. It's very, very costly, because you need parents you need personnel who themselves are educated in a way that they understand these issues, that they understand the cultures of the families that they're working with, and how to get them to change these patterns. And that's not often so easy, as you know. Okay. Let me talk specifically about this issue of quality. And the two big issues are the numbers of children per adult, what we call group size, and the personnel qualifications. In Russia, at least on the data that we have, there are 7 preschoolers to 1 person who actually works with them. In India, it's about 40 to 1. And I won't tell you which one is more like the Almacén, but what do you do when you have 40 of these very young children. It's very difficult to service their needs. Then in terms of qualifications, in Cuba, they have 4 to 5 years of specialized post-secondary training to work with the preschoolers. I mean, it's a very elaborate industry in Cuba. It's very important. It's given a very high priority. And in India, the typical worker has less than a secondary education, often just a primary education, sometimes a year more than primary education. Well, that makes some difference not only in the quality of the services, but also in terms of what the cost is. Nutrition, number of meals a day and quality, pretty obvious. If you don't serve any meals, or if the meals are just a few galletas, and it doesn't make much difference, okay? The extent of the health services and the quality. The degree, I don't have it on here, but if you provide services to parents, that can account for very big difference, because you don't do that in groups, most of it. You can bring some parents to the center, but most of it is actually going out to the home and observing how the parent is taking care of the child, and then helping the parent, giving the parent assistance and some suggestions. And that's very much, how would you say it, customized. So it's a very costly service. And what I want to emphasize in both the quality and the services is that we use a kind of we use a kind of category, a marca, early childhood education, as if this is one thing. It's not one thing. It's many, many different things. So if you ask what is the cost, you have to follow this up with a question: what kinds of services will we provide? What will be the quality of these services? These questions are very, very important. Now let's go to accounting for costs. The first thing that we learned is that existing cost reports are inaccurate and they're incomparable. So when people take them seriously and say, well, in Sweden they pay $12,000 a year, but in this case in Indonesia only $64 a year, que eficiente es Indonesia. Well, that's a peculiar use of the term eficiente. They just do it like the almacén. And in Sweden, there are all of these services: good nutritional services, early parenting services in the household for the infants. There are very, very intense attempts to provide educational stimulation, very careful assessment of each child, so they can report on the development of the child. They can report on the developmental changes. They keep very good records. They have their own assessment systems. It's a different world. These are different worlds, and the fact that we can put them under early childhood education, or that UNESCO does that, is misleading. Again, not because anyone is bad, but it's a misleading category because it covers so much and so many differences. Second thing is that data are from many sources, such as different government levels. In some cases, for example, the national government will provide a teacher. Then the local government must provide a facility. And in many cases, in the tropical areas, these are outdoor facilities, maybe with a few palmas, for a techo de palmas, and nothing more. No, even the water is not through the plumbing or anything like that, because that's all the community can provide. It's all that they can find. And then someone else provides, once a year, a nurse comes around and looks at the children once a year. And that's the health agency that provides that service. So the data are from many sources. They're really not accounted for. The accounting systems are inconsistent and incomplete, and the private sector costs are not accounted for at all in any of these estimates. So if you try to compare the costs, let me just say that they're completely misleading. Anyone who takes them seriously and starts to talk about costs in one country versus cost in another country, different accounting systems, different ways of measurement, different costs are included in the estimates. What we find is for most countries, there's a fairly narrow range. If you use these numbers, there's a fairly narrow range of commitment. So it's about 0.5 to 0.6% of GDP is typical for many countries. Now, exactly what that means, you could say, well, gee, it's very consistent. But you have to remember that 0.5 to 0.6% of a country with very low income is a very small amount, as you see these very, very low commitments and very low services provided in these countries. So it's, to interpret it, it may be the best measure in terms of what a country commits to this particular service. It's not very helpful in terms of what that accounts for, okay? So what we've suggested is that we move forward, instead of just doing a descriptive report and comparing, that in fact there are methods of getting more accurate numbers, not only more accurate numbers, but more accurate descriptions of this in terms of the services provided, more accurate descriptions of the quality of services. I won't go into this. This is the method that we've been using for a large number of years, generally in terms of our center, the so-called ingredients method. And it's actually not a difficult method at all to use to analyze this particular service. So having said that, it's a very interesting area, and I want to thank you, and I would be happy to take questions or hear your discussion. Thank you very much.